French perfect tense. You've come here potentially because you don't know how to use it, don't feel confident, and you want a little bit of support. Stay with me and I'm going to help you to feel super confident in when to use the perfect tense, the Passé Composé, how it's formed, how it's used, and you're going to have lots of practice during this video to help you feel super confident. And then by the end of it, you will be able to use it, no problems at all. Let's get started. What I'm going to do is I'm going to break this video down into 3 sections. Regular perfect tense, irregular perfect tense formation, and then Dr. Mrs. VANDERTRAMPP verbs. Breaking them down into sections will be able to help you pinpoint where you're struggling. If you just feel completely unconfident about all of them, watch the video the whole way through. The Passé Composé, or the perfect tense, is just talking about things that have happened in the past, recently, or that have finished. Can you spot in these sentences which ones are actually in the past tense? Take a moment, have a think. Pause it if you'd like to, a bit more time. Hopefully you have realised that sentences 1, 3, 5 are in the perfect tense, the past tense. They are showing you that these actions are finished. Look at the translations. For number 1, 3, 5. The others are actually in the present tense. And that's a good way to think about, is it a present tense sentence or is it a past tense sentence? So, how do we actually form the past tense? In English, we say something like maybe like I ate or I have eaten. We played or we have played today. But in French, you can't use one verb like I ate or I played. 3 parts to the past tense. So the first part is always going to be the subject. So, I mean, not necessarily always, but you definitely need a subject in the sentence. That could be like je, tu, il, elle, nous, vous, il, and elle. The person who's doing the action. It doesn't always have to be a pronoun like that. It could also be the name of a person, like Christiane or Cécile. Or it could be my parents, mes parents. You definitely need that in the sentence. If you haven't got it, there's something missing. Second thing that you need, second thing is something called an auxiliary verb. Don't worry about the name. What you need to remember, it's either avoir in the present tense or être. Do you know your verbs avoir and être in the present tense? The third thing that you're going to need is a past participle. I call it PP. Past participle or PP. So the past participle is the past form of the verb and it's going to show you, like it's going to give you the meaning of what's going on. Have a look at the sentences 1, 3, 5. Could you please identify the subject, so the person who's doing the activity, the auxiliary verb, avoir or être, and the past participle. If you need a little bit of help with the auxiliary verb, have a look here. Note them down or put them in the comments. You have identified this one, and you've got all 3 parts. If you haven't, not to worry, you may need to just go away and learn the avoir or learn the être. You feel quite confident and you've got them all, fantastic. Let's just have a quick pause and a recap. To create the Passé Composé, you need how many parts? You need 3 parts. And if you don't have those 3 parts, then it's not the Passé Composé. Something that's just happened, recently happened, or something that's finished. Right, so now we know how to form it. We know that we need 3 parts. We are going to move on to the 3 sections that I told you about earlier. The first section is regular verbs. So these ones follow a pattern. In French, you have the ER verbs, which are the most common. You have IR verbs and you have RE verbs. Can you think of any ER, IR or RE verbs? Note them down now or put them in the comments. Pause if you need to. Hopefully you've created a little bit of a list. I'm going to give you some of my ER verbs here. Tick off the ones that you've got. Here are some of my ER verbs. Tick off any that you've got too. Here are some of my IR verbs. Check off any that you've got too. Now, ER verbs, RE verbs, IR verbs. You can't use them in the past tense because I told you before, these are called infinitive verbs. They're the verbs that end in ER, IR or RE. In French, in the perfect tense of Passé Composé, you have to use a past participle. I often see people using the infinitive. If you do that, no, it's incorrect. We will understand you, but it's not correct. And we are looking for you to be confident by the end of this video. On the perfect tense, how do we create regular verb past participles in French so that you can create the perfect tense? Well, if it's an ER verb, any ideas what you have to do? Get rid of the ER and you cross it off and then you replace it with an E with an acute accent. For example, you possibly have seen jouer. You've possibly seen manger. You've possibly seen écouter. So if you've seen those verbs, think about that and that'll help you. But you cannot say je mangeais. What's wrong with that? Because remember, how many parts do you need to form the perfect tense? You need 3 parts. So you would not say je mangeais, you would say j'ai mangé. And that we use avoir here because there's no movement from A to B. When we're eating, we can be moving around whilst we're eating. The activity is eating and we're not physically moving from A to B when we're eating. How about IR verbs? You've got your list, you've got the ones that I wrote earlier. How do you form the past participle of these regular IR verbs? Well, what do? We get rid of the IR, cross it off, and then we add back an I. I recommend crossing off and adding the I just so that you're following the pattern for all types of the ER, IR and RE verbs. Have a think about the past participles of the verbs that you noted down that are IR verbs. Hopefully you've got things like finir, fini. And here are some more examples too. They're the past participles of IR verbs. Now having a look at the past participles of RE verbs. Any ideas what you do with these? This is a past participle for an RE verb, vendre. So RE verbs in French, if they're regular, they get rid of the RE, cross it off, and then change the RE to a U, like stick a U on the end. So that's the basic way of creating the perfect tense for regular present tense verbs, ER verbs, IR verbs, and RE verbs. Let's have a little practice. So I'm going to give you a little extract here. Have a look at that extract. Just take a moment or two to read it through. I would like you now to identify all of the perfect tense with the regular verb. So using subject, avoir in the present tense and the past participle. Note them down or just kind of point to them on the screen now. Alright, so hopefully you've been able to notice that. Using the verbs from earlier, could you write down 3 to 5 sentences using the perfect tense? You could use this to help you if you need a bit of support, otherwise you have a go. Now we're going to move on to the irregular past participles. So what is an irregular past participle? Well, it doesn't follow a pattern, it's irregular. Like with the regular verbs, you have the IR, RE, ER verbs. You have those verbs, but instead of getting rid of the IR and adding an E, taking the ER off and adding an EQ accent, or the RE off and adding a U, instead, they change completely. Do you know any irregular verbs or irregular past participles? You probably do. I'm going to give you a couple of examples now. Again, in the comments box or in your notes, write down any of the irregular past participles or irregular verbs that you already know that take avoir. Pause it if you haven't quite finished yet. Okay, so let's try them now. So I'm going to do a quick fire. Just have a quick go, and if you need to go back and watch it again, then feel free to. But just have a go with this quick fire round. Okay, I'm going to try and do them in order. Apprendre. Apprendre, to learn. The past participle is appris. Avoir, to have.
Eu.
Boire, to drink. Bu. Comprendre, compris. Courir, couru. Croire, to believe, cru. Décevoir, déçu. Découvrir, découvert. Écrire, to write, écrit. Être, été. Faire, fait. Lire, lu. Mettre, mis. Offrir, to offer, offert. Ouvrir, to open, ouvrir, to open, ouvert. Pouvoir, to be able to, can, pu. Prendre, pris. Recevoir, reçu. Suivre, to follow, suivi. Venir, venu. Voir, to see, vu. And vouloir, voulu. Yeah. They are your irregular past participles that you're going to need for GCSE French perfect tense. Any that you don't know, like, feel free to go back and note them down. Make sure you go away and learn them. At least be able to recognise them. Ideally, you want to be able to use them in spoken and written work too. Now we've talked about irregular perfect tense. We've talked about irregular perfect tense. Now remember, for the irregular perfect tense, you still need your three parts. You still need your subject, auxiliary verb, and pretty much it's avoir, and then your past participles. There are irregular verbs, which we'll look at later, that don't take avoir, but take être. So avoir is used with verbs where there is no movement from A to B and no change of state. So for example, if we look at these ones here that we've seen today, in this just previous activity, there is no movement from A to B when we are reading. No movement from A to B when we are drinking. In general, you just drink. You can drink on the spot. You're not moving from A to B when you're drinking. So these ones take avoir in the perfect tense. So what I want you to do is I want you to fill in the gaps for these sentences here. Translations are below, and see what's missing, which past participle do we need. I'm going to show you the answers. How did you get on? Hopefully you've got those three parts. Hopefully you've used the right past participle. Hopefully you've used the right form of the auxiliary verb, avoir. If not, watch this part again, and I've got an activity sheet, a worksheet in the comments below, so feel free to download that and then have a go at anything that you don't feel 100% confident about. If you'd like to have a go now, feel free in the comments box below to write 3 to 5 sentences using any of these verbs that we spoke about earlier. Let's have a look now at this is my favourite, Dr. Mrs. VANDERTRAMPP verbs. What do you think these letters stand for?
These are the words that Dr. Mrs. VANDERTRAMPP stand for, plus their translations.
So far you've learned that the auxiliary verb is avoir for the perfect tense. The good thing is here that you still need your 3 parts for the perfect tense. For these verbs, only these Dr. Mrs. VANDERTRAMPP verbs at the moment, you need to be using être. So être is used with verbs where there is a range of movement from place A to place B, or where there is a change in state. Look at these like diagrams. Pick one to make sure you feel confident with Dr. Mrs. VANDERTRAMPP verbs. As you can see though, it's a change of state. So like going from like living to dying. To become, you're going from like this person potentially to this person. Now can you have a go at filling in the gaps? What does Dr. Mrs. VANDERTRAMPP stand for? Some of them are regular, which will help you. Some of them are irregular. Feel free to pause the video now to note those down. All right, let me show you then the answers. So the Dr. Mrs. VANDERTRAMPP verbs are these ones here. Right, so now let's go into this a little bit deeper. Here are some sentences using Dr. Mrs. VANDERTRAMPP verbs, and you'll notice something about some of them. What is it that you notice that's different to what I've already told you? I'm going to show you now. Hopefully you can see that there are E's, S's, ES's here added to some of the past participles. Now you only add these with the Dr. Mrs. VANDERTRAMPP verbs because they take être, to highlight the subject.
If the person who is speaking could be a female, then you would add an E to the spelling. If it's a male, you don't add anything to the past participle. If it's a group of females, then you add an E and an S. And if it's just a group of males or predominantly males, then you add an S to the past participle. But only for Dr. Mrs. VANDERTRAMPP verbs.
Add to this one. Hope that was useful for you. Remember, it's just a recap of the perfect tense in French, so you feel a bit more confident with regular verbs, irregular verbs, Dr. Mrs. VANDERTRAMPP verbs. How many parts are there in the perfect tense? 3. Usually 3, and then with reflexive verbs there's 4 parts in the perfect tense. How do you form regular past participles? Remember, RER verbs, you get rid of the ER, add an EQ accent. RE verbs, remove the RE and add an U. And for IR verbs, remove the IR and add an I. Which irregular past participles do you remember? Hopefully you know some of these. Did you know 5 of them? Can you remember your Dr. Mrs. VANDERTRAMPP verbs? The Dr. Mrs. VANDERTRAMPP verbs that you need to know.